All right. Before I begin my lecture for the day, let me just mention where we are in the syllabus and what we're going to be doing over the course of the next couple of weeks. So I don't expect you to have your syllabus with you, but that's fine. So today I'm going to obviously wrap up my discussion of the question of caste and Dalit identity and Dalit politics in India today. And I expect to actually, spend not more than maybe 30 to 45 minutes doing that, and then move to the next section, which is on work and life in the city. I think what I'm going to be doing is principally giving you a little idea about labor history in India. But rather than talking about it now, we'll do that later today. Then for the following week, if you look through your syllabus, what you'll see is that I have a section which has to do with gender, with women in South Asia, what has been the role of women in Indian public and political life. Some of those observations are observations that one might certainly make of women in other South Asian countries as well. I think there's some differences. I'm going to try to alert you to what some of the differences might be in the status of women in India as compared to, for example, Pakistan on the one hand and Bangladesh on the other hand. I don't know how many of you are aware, but about 2 months ago, I think it was about 2 months ago, there was an article in the New York Times which pointed out that India had sent a mission to Mars successfully. And the photograph that accompanied that article was actually quite striking. I remember that both my wife and I saw that on the front page of the New York Times. I'm still one of those few left outs who actually gets a print edition of the newspaper delivered to my door every day. So in the morning, we look at this article, and one of the things that was really striking, and it struck both of us immediately, was that the photograph that accompanied the article showed a disproportionately large number of women scientists. Okay, so so they had a picture of the Indian team that had worked on this project, and the majority of them were women. I mean, that was quite striking. And when I was teaching at the University of Delhi about 4 years ago, I was teaching there for about a year. I had taken leave from here and gone back to India. And so when I became a member of the faculty there, I received a huge handbook which described all the departments, something similar to what they have over here. And what struck me was that the majority of the graduate students doing PhDs in the mathematics department were women. Now, if you look at the mathematics department at UCLA or at almost any American university, you'll find that the proportion is about 90 to 10. 90% of the graduate students, people who are doing their doctorates in subjects such as mathematics and physics, are men. And you're going to find about 10% women. Now, that's certainly not the case in India. Right? On the other hand, of course, we know that the condition of women is appalling in many respects. So one of the things we're going to attempt to do, and I'm just mentioning it now because I want you to start thinking about it, reflecting about it when you delve into the readings, is I want to try to explore some of these kinds of contradictions, and that's partly what we'll do when we look at that section. And then following that will be a section on public and popular culture in India. There's a film that I expect you to see. The film is called Diwar, and I've written a short book on it which has been prescribed for the course as well. So I want you to see that film in its entirety. It will be available through what is called the video furnace. So if you go to the class link, then at the bottom left you will find a link which says Video Furnace, and it takes you to the film. And you can watch it from any campus computer, and it's available to you until the end of the quarter. But it's also available on YouTube. That's probably the easiest way to see it, although I haven't checked to see how good the quality is on YouTube and whether it has subtitles. You will need subtitles, except those of you who are South Asian and understand Hindi. But otherwise you will need subtitles for the film. So you should watch that film, and that will be something that we will be talking about when we return back to class from the Thanksgiving break. So next week, I don't think I really need to remind you, but there's only class on Tuesday because Thursday is a Thanksgiving holiday. All right, so this is where we are in the schedule, and week 9, which is that public popular culture, by the end of that week, we'll be entirely caught up in the syllabus. Now let me go back to my lecture, my subject for today. So I've been talking to you about reservations, and recall what I'd said, that when the Constitution of India was drafted, the idea was, and this was Ambedkar's own idea, so Ambedkar is the principal leader of the Dalit community, not known by that name, of course, back then in the 1920s, 30s. Today, incidentally, even though Gandhi is the father of the nation, you can get away by abusing Gandhi. There are no consequences, really. But try abusing B.R. Ambedkar, and you will almost certainly be in very serious trouble. Very serious trouble. Okay? Possibly get lynched in some places. Right? So, for example, sometimes when you have a reaction to the Dalit leader, once in a rare while you'll read an article in a newspaper which will say that overnight some miscreants, as they are called, some hooligans came and they garlanded a statue of Ambedkar with a garland of shoes. So to garland a statue with a garland of shoes is considered to be highly demeaning and derogatory. And when they do that, what they find is that you're going to have a riot in the city or in the town or the village where such an act of desecration has taken place. Gandhi's statues are routinely desecrated, and frankly, there's really not much of a price to be paid for the most part. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the political register in India has shifted entirely toward the Dalits, not at all. It's just that Ambedkar, the leader of the Dalits, is virtually an untouchable in a different sense now, right? That you can't touch him. He's sacrosanct, almost. So that's the status of the man that we're really talking about today. And Ambedkar, 1947, late 1947, early 1950, during the time that he's the head of the drafting commission, he himself comes to the view of the drafting commission for the Constitution. He comes to the view that reservations are only going to be essential for 10 years, and that he was hopeful that the situation would be sufficiently redressed. Right? And of course, as I pointed out to you, that's not the case, not even remotely the case. And this is, I think, an argument which was at least partly made, although that was not the main substance of his talk, by Sainath when he was talking about rural India and the conditions under which people live and work in many parts of rural India. Of course, the Dalit population is scattered throughout India, not just in rural areas. And in fact, I was trying to suggest to you that there is a migration, substantial migration from rural areas to urban centers among the Dalits, because they can escape their past, their history, their caste, by going to a large metropolis. Now, the Mandal Commission. So just to conclude my story about the reservation, so the Mandal Commission is a commission that was appointed in the late 1970s. Most of these commissions, as is the case in the US, they're usually named after the chairman or the chairwoman of the commission. So this was named after the chairman of the commission by a man by the name of Mandal. And one of the things that the Mandal Commission did was it issued a very lengthy report on how reservations had worked in India, to what extent they had worked, whether the system in its present shape and form in the late 1970s, early 1980s ought to be continued in that particular way, or whether there should be significant modifications. And the essence of the matter is that the Mandal Commission essentially recommended that the reservations be increased substantially. So it pointed out that the reservation should be increased to 49.5%, okay, at the central government level. So this is for central government jobs, or what would be called federal government jobs in the United States, and at central universities, right? Rather than state-run universities, that is not regional universities, but what are designated as central universities. The University of Delhi would be a good illustration of such a university. 49.5%, because if you go over 50, then of course effectively you're saying that you're no longer having reservations for a minority, you're having reservations for something called the majority, because you've gone over 50%. This did not preclude in states from having their own reservation policy. So there might be a state, for example, the state of Tamil Nadu in South India, where reservations in certain areas went up to 80%. That is that 80% of all jobs at a particular university or at a particular institution are going to be reserved for people who are disadvantaged. People who belong either to, remember, the SCs, the scheduled castes, or the STs, or people who are Dalits. And one of the things that started happening in India around this time is that many people argued that these reservations should be extended to people who are not just Dalits. So remember, these are the categories we're talking about: scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, okay, and Dalits. And recall that Dalits are those who there are lots of theories about how this fifth caste came about, but the fourth bottom caste, the Shudras, might have fragmented, and then the lowest of them became the Dalits. That's one theory among many others. Now, the important thing simply is this, that some people argued that yes, these are all communities that are historically disadvantaged, but there may be communities that are economically backward today and have been perhaps for a few generations, even though they may not have been historically disadvantaged for centuries. There's no reason to believe that all groups were historically disadvantaged from the beginning, from the outset of time, as it were. So these are called the OBCs. That is the other backward classes, people who did not fall into these categories, but nonetheless felt that if they belong to one of the OBCs, that they should also be the beneficiary of reservation policies. And the Mandal Commission, when it brings out its report is issued, the then government of India understood that if this report was released to the public, it would probably cause a huge ruckus, that there would be a political storm which might be difficult for the government to weather, because effectively what the Mandal Commission was doing was it was raising reservations at the central government level from about 25% to 49.5%. And if these reservations are intended only for these kinds of people, of course there were people from middle class families who were saying that, well, how are we going to get into institutions if you've reserved half the jobs already? Right? What are the possibilities that a middle-class kid is going to now be getting into one of these institutions? Now, this is not even remotely an analogy, but you might think of it this way. The University of California system, and I'm sure that there's some of you who don't know this, but the University of California system, which of course, as you do all know, is the leading public university system in the United States, when it was set up with the intention that the top 2% of graduating seniors from California schools would automatically get entitled to a place at one of the UCs, not necessarily Berkeley or UCLA, but one of the UCs. Okay? Now, we know that that's no longer the case. It's not even remotely the case now, and the situation has become much more aggravated because one of the things that the UC system has done, it has deliberately increased its intake of foreign students. Why foreign students? Because foreign students are frankly cash cows for the university. They're paying 3 times the tuition that a domestic student is paying. And if your revenues are insufficient from other sources, and I'm sure that some of you know that the regents raised all of your tuition fees, okay, right? If your revenues are insufficient from other sources, what are you going to do? You're going to increase the number of foreign students. But when you do that, you are abdicating your mandate to the students at the UC in California. That's what you're doing effectively, right? In other words, a betrayal, frankly, if one had to use a stronger word, right, of the rights of students. Now, something like this is what the middle class is thinking in India. When they're saying, the Mandal Commission is saying, we're going to increase the reservations to almost 50%. So how are all of us going to get in there? And I'm not taking a position here on the Mandal Commission. I'm telling you what exactly some of them were thinking. And so what the government did was it buried the report for 10 years. It just buried the report. But then finally you have a change of government, a new man comes into power, VP Singh, a person who believed himself to have a social conscience, that he was now going to correct the historic wrongs that communities had suffered in India, etc., etc. He resuscitates the report, brings it out removes the dust, as it were, releases it to the public. And there was a storm, a political storm. So you had the scenario, I can remember that vividly because I had gone back to India, on one of my frequent trips. You had young, middle-class Indians who were committing suicide on the streets, just burning themselves to death in protest against the Mandal Commission's policies on reservations. Because what did the government do? The government said, it didn't just release a report, it said, we're going to implement the report. We're going to actually implement this reservation policy. So this remains a highly contested issue in India. And again, I think affirmative action is not even remotely comparable, because with the numbers we are talking about in the US as compared to the numbers you're talking about in India, there's an astronomical difference. Okay, astronomical difference that you're talking about. You're not talking about affecting 2 or 3% of the population. You're talking about a huge number of people. And then, of course, the politics is very convoluted, because one of the interesting things that happened, and I think that India is one of the few places in the world where you can point to something as astonishing as that. There were people who actually came from relatively well-off families. Okay? But they were now trying to, these communities, these relatively well-to-do communities, they were now trying to have themselves recognized as OBCs. So in other words, they were trying to have their social status lowered. Why? Because if they could be declared to be a part of an OBC community, that community would automatically be entitled to reservations. Right? Because usually, of course, what do social groups that are disadvantaged try to do? They try to raise themselves, right? Not just in the material sense, in the economic sense, but in the perception that people have. That is that you want to appear to have a higher status than you actually do. Right? In this case, we are saying that there were actually communities which were saying, no, we are a lower status than what you have assigned us. And if indeed that community could now be declared to be an OBC community, then it stood to be the beneficiary of certain social policies. So what I want to do in this case here, I mean, I've mentioned to you what the policy reservations is. You've got this other reading where it asks you to read any 20 or 30 pages out of 100, 150 pages, That's a book which basically gives you frontline stories of atrocities being committed against Dalits. And when I say atrocities, I'm talking about Dalit houses being burned down, particularly in rural areas, the sexual molestation of Dalit women. It's not that the Dalit women are the only women who are getting sexually molested necessarily. It's just that when a Dalit woman gets sexually attacked, the consequences for the perpetrators are negligible. Negligible, usually. I mean, there may be a remote case here or there where obviously the government, for various reasons, or because the Dalit may have a very strong political lobby. Right? So what I want to do is I want to expand that discussion of the Dalits to give you a sense of where they're located in Indian society today. So for example, if you look at the electoral path, right? There is a political party, it's called the BSP. That's the acronym in India, Bahujan Samaj Party. Its leader for a long time has been a woman by the name of Mayawati. She lost power quite recently. But one of the paths that the Dalit have chosen for their advancement, because what are we looking at here? We're looking at the subject of how does a community that has been historically disadvantaged, right? How does it seek to advance itself? And one of the ways, of course, is it avails of reservation policies. One other interesting path that we have to think about is the electoral path. And the electoral path is that you say that, well, you number 200 million people. Now, if you number 200 million people, you obviously constitute a lobby, right? If you can be united. And of course, there are differences within the Dalits. There are differences within the Dalits, but one of the attempts made by Dalit political organizations, such as the Dalit Panthers. So if you read that little book here, right, one of the documents it has is the manifesto of the Dalit Panther Party, named after the Black Panthers in the United States. That's where they got their model from. Right? And the Dalit Panther Party is a radical party which has been arguing for a certain kind of Dalit politics which would be divested of the kinds of usual considerations that people might have in mind when they're thinking about how the Dalits should locate themselves in Indian society. They take a very radical view. Before we get to them, the electoral path that I'm talking about then is simply what? It means that the Dalits, since they constitute a substantial portion of the Indian population, have decided that they're going to actually utilize the instruments of Indian democracy. And the first instrument of Indian democracy that you utilize in order to try to advance your interest is you take the electoral path. Right? And this is what the Bahujan Samaj Party did. And so, for example, in the state of Uttar Pradesh and in the neighboring state of Bihar, you find that the BSP has had a considerable political clout, ruling party for some years. Right? Considerable political clout. And this is related to the comment I made about Ambedkar, that because Ambedkar is the champion of the Dalits, he died 50 years ago, some years after he had finished drafting the Constitution, and he converted to Buddhism. In fact, one of the last acts of his life was to lead 500,000 of the Dalits in a mass conversion to Buddhism. Okay? So sometimes they're referred to as neo-Buddhists. But in the event, the critical thing is that the electoral path has been important. Now, not all of them have embraced it, because some of them think that, well, this is just a bourgeois institution, this idea of electoral democracy. And it's not really going to get us anywhere, because in an electoral democracy, if we are being courted, we are only being courted because the politicians want our votes. They're not really sincerely interested in our advancement. Now, you're familiar with those arguments from the American context. You know, a politician might court a Latino community and might inwardly think that, well, you don't give a damn about them, but, well, they constitute a certain percentage of the vote. And therefore, it's important for me to cultivate the community. Right? So that's what I mean. And electoral coalition should be seen in, again, that same context, except that we can broaden it out, that sometimes Dalits might even enter into political coalitions with groups that otherwise seem to be at odds with them. Right? And so, for example, one of the electoral alliances that you had was what was called KAM in the state of Gujarat. And it's extraordinary. Okay, so what is this electoral alliance? So K is Kshatriyas, that is the warrior administrator caste, right? H is Harijans, Dalits. Okay, A is Adivasis, that is the scheduled tribe population, the STs, those who belong to indigenous tribal groups. And M is Muslims. Right? Now, how do you forge an alliance between four such groups? But they did, because they're fighting a different kind of upper caste hierarchy. That's what they're doing. So sometimes they will enter into electoral coalitions because it is in their political interest to do so. Now, within the same context, to wrap up this discussion about Dalit advancement, right, one of the other ways in which a group might seek to advance itself is through the process of what is called Sanskritization. And let me just explain to you very, very briefly what it means. So obviously the word is taken from the word Sanskrit, which is the language, the ancient language, the classical language, I should say, not the ancient language, the classical language of India. All right? Certainly the classical language, the substantial parts of India, and in fact the Sanskrit extended well beyond India at some point. You know, there's one scholar who has spoken about what he calls the Sanskrit cosmopolis, because Sanskrit became highly influential in such places as Southeast Asia, where there was a very considerable Buddhist and Hindu presence for centuries. Right? Now, we don't need to be detained by that history. It simply gives you a sense of what we're talking about when we speak about the classical language of India. It was also the language in which the sacred texts were written. And it is the language that is obviously associated with the upper caste, particularly the Brahmins. So, you know, what is the language in which the Rig Veda was composed and written eventually? Initially, it exists in the oral tradition. Right? Most of India's sacred texts exist in the oral tradition. So the Rig Veda is the oldest of those, and the language of composition is Sanskrit. So Sanskrit, in other words, had a very high status. Again, as with almost everything else, we have to simplify the argument here, because if we got into the complexities of the social history of Sanskrit, then we will find all kinds of other things as well, which might be quite intriguing. But the gist of it is that it was associated with a high caste. Now, when a low caste person wants to raise his or her status, they Sanskritize. What does that mean? It means that they begin to emulate, imitate, if you want, the social practices of the upper castes. What would be an illustration? Let me give you two illustrations, because again, both of them will help us understand some of the social history of modern India. And one of them will take us to the whole issue of gender, which we're going to look at in a slightly more concentrated way later on. One illustration, very simple one, let's begin with a simpler one, is that the upper castes, and again, this is not uniformly true in India, but it is true of the upper caste in some parts of India, the Brahmins, and when I say the upper caste here now, I mean specifically the Brahmins, are likely to be vegetarian. Not uniformly across India. It's not true of Bengali Brahmins, it's not true of Kashmiri Brahmins, for example, but it would be true of Brahmins in some parts of, for example, South India. Right? So a Brahmin is going to be a strict vegetarian. And in India, when you say vegetarian, it means vegetarian. It doesn't mean you eat fish. Okay, I've come across lots of people in this country who call themselves vegetarians, and then you find, well, they actually eat fish. Okay, and they're not vegans either. That's a modern American term. Okay, giving up dairy products. Vegetarians in India, in fact, do not give up dairy products at all, right? Because that's their main sustenance. But a vegetarian means complete abstention from any kind of meat, seafood, and often garlic and onions, because garlic and onions have very strong smell. So there's an aesthetic reason as well behind, and a different kind of sensory history of vegetarianism. That's what a vegetarian is. Now, what does a lower caste person do? So let's say you're a Dalit, and tomorrow in your village, let's take an extreme example of this case. Tomorrow you win the lottery, and now suddenly you find yourself got $1 million. Okay, the equivalent of that in Indian rupees. So can you just simply change your status now, because now you've got $1 million? And we go back to a question that somebody had raised, and I had answered that question in the last lecture, and I said, well, the problem is that you might have $1 million or $10 million, and you might have bought a Jaguar and be riding around in the village in your little Jaguar, okay? But everybody knows you're a Dalit. Everybody knows that. You can't escape that. So what do you do to attempt to escape that, other than fleeing to the city? One of the things you attempt to do is you Sanskritize. So because you're low caste, you're likely to eat everything, including beef, which no Hindu, certainly no Orthodox Hindu, would touch. Right? So what do? You stop eating meat, because that is going to increase your respectability among the upper caste. That's what it means to Sanskritize. So a person who eats meat, or who is indiscriminate about what he eats, will eat everything, right? That person will now start to emulate the upper caste Brahmins, and that means that this person will now stop eating meat. That would be a simplest illustration. Okay? Let me give you a more complex illustration of this phenomenon. This will take us to the gender thing. The more complex illustration is the practice of what is called dowry. Okay? And I want to just talk about that for a couple of minutes, because it shows the intersectionality here of issues of caste and gender. Okay? Caste, class, and gender, all three. So dowry is what a woman gives or brings, okay, with her when she gets married. So, although, by the way, by law in India, let me be very clear about that. By law, the giving and taking of dowry is illegal. It's an offense. Okay? So you've got the Dowry Prohibition Act of 1973. But what is dowry? So dowry is a woman gets married, And so let's say the man that she gets married to, let's take again a slightly extreme example of that, okay? Just because it'll make it very clear to you what exactly is going on here. So the man she's getting married to says to the girl's family, or the woman's family, that I'll only marry your daughter on the condition that she brings a certain kind of dowry with her marriage. Okay? And in this extreme example, let's supposing the man she's getting married to has a younger brother, and the younger brother just got admitted to Harvard, but doesn't have money. That family doesn't have enough money to be able to send him to Harvard. And the woman that this man is marrying to, she belongs to an extremely wealthy family. So the dowry demand by the husband's family might be that the woman must bring $500,000 or the equivalent thereof in cash with her. This is going to be part of the dowry, because then that will be used by the husband's family to educate the younger son of that family. Okay? Now, traditionally what dowry meant was, so I mean, I'll give you the illustration of my parents, because I've talked to my parents about it to see exactly what she brought with her in her dowry, my mother, when she got married. So in those days when you got married, right, I'm talking about the 40s and 50s now, and even earlier, but in this case the 50s, early 50s, right? So, and they would always make a list, by the way, of all the things that the woman takes with her in marriage as part of her dowry. And so that included what? It included, for example, bedding. It included a chest of drawers, 4 frying pans, 2 pots. Because the whole idea was you use a dowry to set up a household. You use a dowry to set up a household. That's what happened over the years, moving into the 60s, 70s, 80s, is these dowry demands began to accelerate. Where the man's family, the groom's family said, we'll only marry this woman. I'll only marry this woman if her family gives such and such. So, you know, for example, she must bring a Maruti car. Maruti is the name of an Indian car company. The first company that started really producing cars for the masses in India. Okay, so this would be a dowry demand. And I'll tell you what the connection is with the changes that I've been talking about with caste and all of that in just a moment. But let me finish this story, this particular segment of the story with respect to the question of gender, because again, it'll help you think about the next section. So one of the things that began to happen, and you began to read about it frequently in Indian newspapers, was what were called dowry debts. Dowry-related debts. A serious problem. A very serious problem that we're talking about. Okay? And what were these dowry-related debts? A woman gets married, and you know, you start hearing that, well, she's being tormented by her husband's family. Why is she being tormented by her husband's family? Because she didn't bring enough dowry. Now, after the marriage, they're saying, well, you know, the groom says to his wife, a young wife, well, your father, you know, he's a miser. You know, that person is rather strict with his money. Your father had a lot more money than you indicated to me, and I'd like you to bring in another $20,000 into this family, right? So these are dowry demands, and when the girl's family or the bride's family refused to meet these demands, you would then read an account in a newspaper the following day that a woman's garments caught fire while she was cooking on the stove, and she got burned to death. And these were actually engineered deaths. There's no question about it. And we're not talking about, by the way, I mean, I don't want you to go away with the impression that we're talking about millions of cases a year. No. I mean, but frankly, one case is too many, and we're talking about dowry debts which in some years ran to as high as 1,000. And these are debts that we know about. These are debts that have been conceded by the state. And you know, you can be sure that the actual number of debts was substantially higher, because the state is always going to give you the lower end of the numbers for all of these issues. Now, let's go back to Sanskritization. So, dowry was not the practice. That's the critical thing among the lower castes. It was not. It was not the practice among STs, scheduled tribes. In fact, in their communities, it was often the reverse practice. The reverse practice was that when a man and a woman got married, a man and his family had to set aside a certain sum of money. And that sum of money was promised to the woman if, for example, there should be a separation or divorce between the two later on. The equivalent in Islam is, in South Asia, meher, it's what it's called. This is the money that is set aside by the husband's family. However, when the lower caste began to Sanskritize, what did they do? They gave up the practice of bride price, as it's called, bride price, and they started embracing the practice of dowry. Okay? So this is what is called Sanskritization. And why were they doing it? Because this was one way in which you increased your social status in that particular area, or among the communities of your particular locality. Okay? So this is one way in which some Dalits thought that they could actually advance, at least with respect to social status. And then we've got the question of inter-caste marriages. That would this be one way in which Dalits could... So B.R. Ambedkar, Ambedkar was quite certain that the only thing that would lead to the demolition of the caste system, and he was quite clear, you're not actually doing that reading in this class, but he's got a short book, it's called The Annihilation of Caste, and he is extremely clear in that the only thing that would lead to the complete destruction of caste as a system, because he was opposed to it tooth and nail. He didn't see a single worthy thing about the institution of caste. Okay? And he was quite certain in his mind that the only thing that would lead to the complete destruction of the caste system eventually would be inter-caste marriages. Because his whole argument is that the caste system is based on the notion of closed communities, that each of these castes is closed, and this is what distinguishes it from the institution of class. So you have to remember that class and caste are not the same thing, at least in the ordinary understanding of the term, because the argument here is that class is a system of stratification. And in the system of stratification, you can move up and down the ladder, right? You might be upper class, right? But then you lose all of your money because the stock market has collapsed and all your money was tied up with stocks, and suddenly you reduce from being a billionaire to being nothing, right? You move down the ladder. But then you might have a good turn of fortune, and you might move up the ladder again, and thus the rags to riches, etc., etc. Okay? So that's class. Again, in the simplest, most rudimentary sense, system of stratification. Caste is a system of hierarchy. Hierarchy. And there's a hierarchy, and in this hierarchy, there is no movement. Now, whether that is in fact historically the case or not is extremely controversial and debated. Because we know, for example, from Indian history, I could give you dozens of illustrations, but we know from Indian history that there have been ruling dynasties made up of Shudras, the lowest caste. Shudra ruling dynasties, just as we know that there were slaves that were in fact actually ruling dynasties, right? And one can demonstrate that quite easily. But of course, people could say, well, that was true of a group as a whole in certain circumstances, but were there people who are actually individually able to transcend their caste? And Ambedkar's submission was, that's not possible. That's not possible. So in any case, what he did was he invested a great deal in the idea of intercaste marriage, although he also understood that the likelihood of that happening, and I spoke to you about that in my last lecture, the likelihood of that happening is really quite negligible. And finally, but this is not to say that these are the only ways, but these are some of the most evident ways once you begin to study the subject. Finally, the last way that you can think about for how the Dalits might have thought about a strategy of advancement is through revolutionary violence and class warfare. And there are people who will argue that this, in effect, is the only thing that really works. Now, before we terminate this particular discussion, I just want to look very briefly at a couple of things in this little book, because I think, some of these stories and some of the narratives that you hear, that you have here, are really quite extraordinary. So, for example, I don't know, for those of you who did the second module, because I said you can read any 2 out of 4, unless you want to read the whole book. But this is a story about a woman, a Dalit woman, who becomes a professor of Sanskrit, right? Which is really quite extraordinary. Because, of course, as a Dalit and a woman on top of that, she was not expected to be educated at all. Right? So that's the historical disadvantage you would have, that you would be coming from a community where you would have absolutely no access to education, and a Dalit woman would be really expected to simply serve others, to be engaged, if at all she was engaged in work outside the home, to be engaged in what you would describe as servile labor. Right? Where is the luxury of being educated? Where are the schools? If you read the Sainath reading, where are the schools where a Dalit woman is going to get educated? But she gives a narrative where she not only gets educated, but she decides from an early childhood she's going to become a professor of Sanskrit. Now, Sanskrit is the language of the Brahmins. It's the preserve of elite male Brahmins for the most part. And so what this story does is it narrates this experience where she says that, well, this is what she wanted to do, and there was this look of incredulity on the part of everyone when she would tell people what she wanted to do. And then she finally got a government job. She was appointed a professor of Sanskrit by a government order because she wrote a letter to a minister saying, well, I've got a degree in Sanskrit, I'm a qualified pandit, okay, a priest as it were, okay, scholar in this case, of Sanskrit, but nobody's giving me a job. So she writes a letter to the minister, and she's called for an interview, and she is now professor of Sanskrit. So, of course, the question here would be, well, what do we infer from that? Do we simply infer that there is upward mobility for some Dalits? Well, I think that's unquestionably the case. And that's what I was trying to suggest to you, that there are actually Dalits who are dollar billionaires in India today. Right? That's not true of course, more than a handful of them. But many of the other stories here suggest exactly the contrary, right? Namely that there are persistent problems. So one of the stories that you have here is called the New Custom. Okay? And what is a new custom? It's a story about this man who arrives at a little village. So he's just been dumped by the bus. He's gotten down from this state roadways bus, and he goes to a chai shop, tea shop. So he goes there, orders a cup of tea, and he gets into a conversation with the man who runs his tea shop. And the man, eventually the conversation comes around to the point, well, the man says, well, what are you doing in this town? And he says, I've come for a wedding. Well, whose wedding is it? Because the chai shop, the chai shop is that corner shop where they know everything that's going on around the village. Of course, everything, right? And so he says, well, I've come for the marriage of Dharam's daughter. So this man says, oh, really? I thought I knew everything that was going on. I haven't heard of such a marriage taking place. Right? Well, it turns out, to cut a long story short, it turns out that this man is a Dalit, the customer here. He's come for, there's a Dalit man whose name is Dharam as well, and he's come for that wedding, not for the Dharam who's the Brahmin. There's a Dharam or whatever the name is, and who's a Brahmin in that village too. The minute the tea shop owner finds out, because if he's come to attend a Dalit's wedding, he is most likely a Dalit himself. Right? The minute he finds out, what does he do? He says to him, wash your own teacup. That's the notion of contamination, pollution, that you've drunk from this tea, you've contaminated. Now you've got to wash it yourself. I'm not going to wash the teacup from which you've had this tea. And this man, of course, is furious, right? So he says, how much is this teacup? And the man sets a price, and he doubles the price because he automatically realizes that he's in for some money now. And so the man just pays him this cash, and he's purchased his teacup, and then tea glass, and then he throws it on the floor and breaks it. Act of defiance. These little acts of defiance are important. Right? And the social history of every country and civilization can be written about it. This first struck me 30 years ago when I read this little book by George Orwell, fantastic little book called Down and Out in London and Paris. And you know, I'm sure many of you know who George Orwell is, right? Because you probably read either 1984 or Animal Farm in school. It's a major English writer of the 20th century, socialist. And in this book, Down and Out in London and Paris, the title should tell you something, Down and Out. So he describes the days when he was struggling to make money, when he was not a recognized writer. And he used to work as a waiter in restaurants in Paris. And he was a person who was, as I said, a socialist, so he had a very sharpened class sensibility, right? He couldn't stomach the idea of working in this restaurant as a waiter and serving people who he thought were vastly inferior to him intellectually, but they just had money, you know? Right? They had money. The Warren Buffetts, if I may say so, of their time, you know? Okay? And so what did he do to retaliate? He tells you that in the book. So for example, before he would bring out the soup, he would spit into it. You know, this was his little act of defiance. And you might say, well, what did that do? Did the guy know or not? You know? Well, we'd have to study this at great length to see what are these little acts of defiance. Because of course, when we can speak about revolutionary violence, it sounds very romantic, you know, the image of Che Guevara there, and class warfare. But one of the ways in which you do this is through small incremental acts of resistance all the time. An extraordinary illustration of this is found, for example, in medieval English history, how women retaliated against men. Because if you're a woman in the 13th, 14th century, what leverage do you have in that society? Your job is to be confined to the house, you know, bearing children, bringing them up, kitchen. You're confined. So how would you retaliate? How would you signify to yourself, not necessarily to the person, because that person might not know, your husband or the other males against whom you're retaliating might not even know what you're doing, but it gives you solace, it gives you comfort, and we have descriptions of what they would do. Well, I'm not going to mention that right now, because then we'll have to give you a long, elaborate account of what, but there's a book by Carolyn Bynum, which is called Holy Fast, Holy Feast, which looks precisely at this question. All right, so this pretty much ends my discussion. The Dalit Panther Manifesto, which is included here, what this Dalit Panther Manifesto effectively really does is simply suggest that there are radical Dalits who think of themselves as having no association with Hinduism at all. Okay? That's the last point I want to dwell on. And I want to reinforce that as you understand what's at stake here. What's at stake here is, there was a debate that took place between Ambedkar and Gandhi. It's the debate over temple entry, as it's called. Because certainly Gandhi was the leading figure in India at that time, and unquestionably still remains the single most important figure in the history of modern India. And his greatest antagonist was Ambedkar. Gandhi, by the way, was not a Brahmin. For those of you who read the piece on Gandhi's assassination, you know that much at least, that he's not a Brahmin. Doesn't come from the completely upper crust. He comes from a grosser caste. So he comes from one of the middling castes. But nonetheless, he's not a Shudra, and he's not a Dalit, certainly. All right? And what is the debate that takes place between them? The gist of it is that Gandhi thought of the Shudras and the Dalits as Hindus. And he thought that Hinduism needed to be reformed, radically reformed. Ambedkar took the view that Hinduism could not be reformed. He's quite clear about that. In fact, he thinks that this is a religion of absolute degradation, and the sooner we bury Hinduism, the better it is. This is his view, in a nutshell. And he does not think of the Dalits as Hindus. Okay. So now the question is, how is one to try to find some way of negotiating, not a settlement between them, but how does one negotiate one's way around this thorny set of questions about what is the relationship of Dalits to this religion called Hinduism? If they're going to convert, they're converting from something to something else, are they not? Right? So you convert from being a lower caste Hindu to being a Muslim or a Christian or a Buddhist. Because those are the three religions, Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, into which you might convert. Now, Gandhi's view was that the Dalits view themselves, the Shudras and the Dalits view themselves as Hindus, but they are not recognized as such by the upper caste one. They are discriminated against. They need to be given full rights within the community of Hindus. And one of the things that Gandhi insisted was that all Hindu temples should open their doors to Dalits, because most Hindu temples, so when we give illustrations of how are the ways in which the Dalits were historically disadvantaged, I've given you numerous illustrations in my last lecture. Right? But one of the things that you could talk about was the fact that most Hindu temples, in fact the vast majority of them, particularly in the 20s, when this whole issue arose, would not have allowed a Dalit to enter that temple. Okay? Simply not permitted. There are other restrictions too. Even today there are restrictions that especially very orthodox Brahmins have, temples have. Even upper caste Hindus have to conform to certain norms before they can enter those temples. Okay? But let's stick to the point that this is Gandhi's view, that so there's a movement, it's called the temple entry movement. The idea was you try to persuade upper caste Hindus, particularly the priests and the management of these temples, to open them up to the Dalits and the Shudras. Ambedkar was opposed to that, because he saw this as a cunning way to try to assimilate the Dalits without giving them any real socioeconomic benefits, assimilate them into Hinduism, defang them, as it were, to defang them, to emasculate them even more. Because he saw, of course, Hinduism as a corrupt, contaminated religion. Okay? So there's this debate that takes place between them. And that's the context, in part, that you have to keep in mind when you read the Dalit Panther Manifesto, because the authors of that manifesto are very clear that they do not view the Dalits as Hindus. They say that the Dalits have a lifestyle and a worldview which is entirely different, that they have gods and goddesses which are not the gods and goddesses of Hinduism or Brahminism. No Shiva, no Vishnu, all of that. And that the Dalits do not recognize the Hindu texts as authoritative for them, as sacred for them, so forth and so on. That the Dalits must create their own language, their own worldview. And again, you might want to, if you had to think of a, analogy, by no means a perfect analogy, but nonetheless, I think a useful one. The comparable thing, and some of you may be familiar with that, are the debates, if I may call it that, between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Okay? On the black African American. The black man, the African American in general. What are the stakes for the African American? Because I think that Malcolm, there's an interesting argument to be made about them moving closer to each other's position towards the end, towards the very end. Both of them, of course, as you know, were assassinated, right? Okay, Malcolm and Martin Luther King were both assassinated. But not worrying about what happens towards the end, whether it's possible to argue that they're slowly moving towards each other's position, which I think, by the way, is also true of Gandhi and Ambedkar. But what's very clear is that for the bulk of the time, they had sharply divergent views about the possibilities of black emancipation in the US. And as I said, for those of you who are more familiar with the American scene, you can begin with that and then transpose some of that to the Indian context to see how you would position Gandhi and Ambedkar. All right, so any questions about Dalits, caste history? I've got time for one or two questions, and then I'm going to begin the next section. Yeah.
Was there any precursor religion to Hinduism?
Any precursor religion? Okay, so vast question, because in order to answer that, we would have to understand how did Hinduism arise. And when I say Hinduism here, I'm not even getting into the problem of the fact that this is an 18th century concept, that they were Shaivites, Shaktos, all of these people who never called themselves Hindu, because no Hindu ever described himself or herself as a Hindu until the 18th century. Okay? We're not even getting into that problem. Let's assume that people did call themselves Hindus, just to simplify the argument. Was there something before Hinduism? So then we'd have to talk about, was there, okay, a kind of a pre-Aryan religion? And is Hinduism only the religion of the Aryans, or are there elements of it from earlier religious formations, right? Those are the considerations we'd have to raise. So I can give you an answer, but we're going to have to sit down for a 4-hour tutorial for that, all right? Impossible to really venture into what was the long past, how did Hinduism come into formation. I think you're asking it from the point of view of the claim that I just made when I was representing somebody, that, well, our religion has nothing to do with Hindu gods and goddesses, so forth and so on, right? That's probably the context. Well, the difficulty there is that there are millions of gods and goddesses in India. Millions. Okay? And local communities might have their own god and goddess, and they don't have to be Dalit communities. There are upper caste communities that may have it too. Right? The divergences in the practices of Hinduism are so vast that it would be impossible to say that, well, Hinduism simply consists of the worship of the pan-Indian gods called Shiva and Vishnu. You know? There are gods. I mean, and if you tell that to Orthodox Hindus, they'll shudder, because some of them are not aware of it. There are gods to whom, when you go to a temple, you take a little gift, as it were. And when I say gift, an offering is the better word. An offering. Okay? You take a little offering. It could be money for the temple. It could be a coconut. Okay? It could be fruit. There are gods who accept as offerings only alcohol and tobacco. I'm telling you. I have seen in Hindu temples elsewhere a god, and the garland is not the garland of marigolds, which is what you would usually find. It's a garland of cigarette boxes, for example. Okay? And the god loves his alcohol. We won't distinguish between different kinds of alcohol here. Yes? Oh, yeah. But then, okay, so then there's a question of, the sacrifice of animals to Kali, right? That's yet a different strand, by the way. Okay, that's a different strand, because when you get to Eastern India, then you find that Shaktoism, the notion of the goddess, is predominant. The goddess in Eastern India. Okay. One last question. Yeah. Okay, can you repeat the question again?
When Islam sort of came into India,
yeah, when Islam came into India.
What was its interaction and relationship with
again, because I'd have to really go over the history of what happens over a period of several centuries, right? It's not something I can really take up without getting into a long historical excursion, yeah? Okay, one last question, and that's it. Maybe from you, because I've taken lots of questions from you, Dominic, before, so let somebody else have a chance.
Just going back to the practice of dowry, you said dowry is not the practice amongst the lower class.
Yeah.
So what were the dollars trying to do?
Well, no, because what the practice was bride price, right? The practice is bride price, which is a reverse, where the husband's family is putting aside money, okay? And so when you Sanskritize, what do? You start to emulate the practices of the upper castes. That's what Sanskritization means. So because the upper castes are engaging in the practice of dowry, therefore these groups, these social groups that never engaged in the practice of dowry, now begin to practice dowry. Right? Is that clear it up? Okay. All right. My apologies. I just have to move on. All right. Now, what I want to do is I want to set up the discussion about labor. And this is, by the way, a section I've never taught before. When I've taught this class before, I've never included it, but over the years, I suppose my political sensitivities have changed a bit, and I've become much more aware of the history of working class people, the history of labor in India. So in my previous versions of this class, I've never included that. And I think it's important to actually look at the lives of the poor, the lives of working class people. What do they do? What is their place? What percentage of them are part of the organized sector, unorganized sector? What are the comparisons with, let's say, China and the United States? Let me begin with that. I'm going to show you a series of images in quick succession as well. And then we'll talk about some of these images, perhaps not today, but maybe in the next lecture. But let me first begin with a brief comment on the labor force before I show you the images, and what percentage of it belongs to the organized sector and what percentage belongs to the unorganized sector. So when we say organized sector and unorganized, let's turn to the US for a moment, because you will immediately understand through this analogy what I mean. So if you live in Southern California and you belong to a relatively well-to-do family, relatively, let's say middle, upper middle especially, you have a gardener. Okay? You have a gardener, and how do you pay your gardener? You do not pay them by credit card, and that income is not reported often. Okay? Usually you just give them cash or a check. Or if you have a maid who comes and cleans up your house, or you've got a babysitter, you know, all of these people belong to roughly what you would call the unorganized sector, which means, by the way, they also have no protection generally, because you're not reporting. You know, technically, by the way, if you're paying anyone over $2,000 in the state of California, technically that person is your employee, and you're responsible for their taxes. Okay, their Social Security, of course, $2,000 would be a minuscule amount, but I'm just telling you what the rules and regulations of the state of California are. You know, okay. So if you've got 2-3 people coming and working around your house, and you know you're paying $5,000 annually to one person, technically, if you're not paying their taxes and they're not reporting their income either, which is almost certainly the case that they're not reporting it, all of that is not only, quote, illegal. That's not what I'm worried about. Not even remotely worried about that. I'm just simply thinking about the fact that these people belong to what you would call the unorganized sector. And therefore, they usually have no protection under labor laws, for example. Now, in India, 94% of the labor force belongs to the unorganized sector. 94%. Okay? There are, and the total labor force when we're talking about, so in the United States, the labor force is approximately 50% of the population, by the way. Approximately. So the population is about 330 million, about 165 million people, roughly, give or take 10 million, belong to the labor force. Okay? And of course, these numbers have changed, because 50 years ago it would have been much lower. Why would it have been much lower? Because there were fewer women. The most substantial increase in the labor force has come about as a consequence of women entering into the labor force. In China, with a population of about 1.3 billion, roughly about 800 million people belong to the labor force. So that's over 60% of the population. In India, only 1/3 of the population, approximately. It may be slightly more, it may be closer to 40%, but between 33 to 40% of the total population belongs to the labor force. And then we can get into definitions of the labor force. Do you have to have worked, you know, minimum of 20 hours, for example, to be part of the labor force here? Okay, we can get into those definitions, but just take these figures as figures which offer comparisons, all other things being equal, between China, the United States, and India for a moment. Now, in India, of that labor force, 94% is unorganized labor. And unorganized labor can be divided itself into several different sectors. When I say organized labor force, that's 6%. The largest percentage of that would be what? Government employees. government employees. People who work for the government, either the central government or one of the state governments. And then the next largest component would be people who work for private corporations. Okay? And that could include obviously banks and industrial houses, businesses, so forth and so on. Okay? So, and usually when you're part of the organized labor force, it also means that your taxes are deducted at source. Right? So for example, I'm a employee of the state of California. You know that all professors at the University of California, we're all technically state employees. Right? And so my taxes get deducted at source. So when I get my paycheck, that a certain percentage has already been deducted for federal tax, income, state tax, Social Security, Medicare, etc., etc. So that's what would happen with that 6% in India. Okay? Your taxes get deducted at source, and they are just about, by the way, the only people in India who are paying income tax. Right? Most people who are independent businessmen are evading tax. The total tax base in India is less than 3%. Less than 3% of the population actually pays income tax. In Pakistan, it's even worse. 1.5% of the population pays income tax in Pakistan. Okay? And of course, one of the things that the government has tried to do in order to increase revenues is they have said, so for example, 20 years ago, they passed a law. I don't remember the exact time, and I don't remember the exact wording of the law, but I'm giving you the approximation, that if you owned either a car or a telephone, okay, or a television set, then you likely belong to a class of people who should be filing a personal income tax return. 20 years ago. Okay? And of course, if you had a passport. If you had a passport, you automatically, because it meant that you probably were the kind of person who was flying overseas. And if you're flying overseas, unless you were swimming all the way to Sri Lanka, you probably had some money. All right? So those are the ways in which the government tried to identify possible taxpayers, because the tax evasion was so enormous and still is. It's like corporations here. You know, Apple. I mean, I know everybody thinks of Steve Jobs as, oh, the great, wonderful innovator, entrepreneur. All these guys, frankly, the corporations pay virtually no taxes at all. You should just look at what Apple and Google pay. Virtually zero. Tax evasion, okay? You have your company names and outfits registered in various other places where the tax laws are much more lax. Criminal activity, in other words, but you deify them as great entrepreneurs and so forth and so on. Okay? Now in India, this is rampant. Okay? But what we are interested in here is, because we're not really looking at the tax structures, okay, you've got 94% of the population which belongs to the unorganized sector. So what do they do? Now, unorganized sector has several different segments. The lowest rung would be, for example, people who work at a brick kiln. I'll show you some images in just a moment. So you've got a brick factory, okay, people who do the dirtiest work you can think of. Let me show you some images first. Some of them are going to be quite shocking, particularly the ones of the Dalits in the sewers. But let me begin. This is not obviously a sewer. This is a metropolitan mall, okay, in the city of Gurgaon, one of these new shining skyscraper cities. It's a suburb of Delhi. It's part of the NCT, National Capital Territory. Yes? Images what? Oh, there's no image. Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. Yeah, usually this is always on, so I've never had to turn it on. That's why I didn't pay any attention. It'll come on in a minute. Okay, why there's something going on here. Just a moment. Yeah, I think there's something wrong with the system. Maybe it switched off to the off position. It's not turning on. Could I ask, if you could just take a look at this maybe and see what's, yeah. So usually when you keep the on, it just comes on. It's not coming on.
Have to.
You can press the laptop, but
It appears to be in process right now.
is that what's happening? Well, maybe we should give it a minute. Okay, while we see if it comes on, let me just mention. Okay, so when I say unorganized sector, so there's this lowest rung. Okay, and the lowest rung would be landless laborers, and they, by the way, belong to another sector as well. That sector would be called seasonal migrant laborers. So when I say seasonal migrant laborers, I'm talking about people who are usually going to be working on farms. It's not coming on, right? Yeah. So I think that we might need to send a note and have it. Yeah, and have it repaired. Yeah. Okay. So I'll have to show you the images, obviously, in my next lecture. But let me just take a few minutes to just lay it out a bit more. Okay. And if you haven't, by the way, done the reading, and you've got one reading only for this section, and I think if you read 120 pages, it will suffice. The book is a very easy read. A Free Man by Aman Sethi, who's a journalist. And what did he do? He basically spent time, hung out, right, with a couple of people who are basically laborers. Right? That's what he was doing. And he's trying to give you some idea of what kind of life they had. What are their, not just what are their employment prospects, what do these people talk about? What is life like for them? You know, what is their love life like? What is their work life like? So forth and so on. That's what it gives you a flavor. So rather than giving you a dry reading with all the statistics, you know, about what percentage of the labor force does X, Y, or Z, what I wanted to do here was to give you a different flavor, and that's why I assigned that particular book. So if you look at this unorganized sector now, because the people that he's talking about, the main characters, they're all part of the unorganized sector. And you understand right now that unorganized sector is not simply a sector that's not reporting its income tax. As I said, I'm not worried about that, because they don't really have an income, frankly, that is worthwhile reporting. But what you have to worry about is the fact that these people have no protections. That the labor laws generally do not apply to them. And as in most areas of life in India, with respect to labor as well, India has the most progressive legislation in the world. No question about it. Some of the most progressive legislation in the world regarding the rights of laborers is to be found in India. Virtually none of it has been implemented ever. All right? So when we speak about protections, we're not only talking about labor laws, we're also talking about such things as medical insurance, access to health facilities. A close friend of mine did a study. He spent over 10 years living among, in some respects, living among working class people in a place called Okla, which is in the National Capital Territory in Delhi. And one of the things that he did was these are people who were working in what are called polishing industries. So these are, for example, brass implements. You know, they have to be polished. So there are machines that do that. So they're working in these industrial units with appallingly low salaries. When I say appallingly low salaries, what am I talking about? I'm talking about, let's say, something in the neighborhood of about 3,000 rupees a month. What would 3,000 rupees be, by the way, today? $50 a month. Okay, that's what we're talking about. $1, $1.50, less than $2 a day, right? And you know, when you're working in these, the likelihood of catching some disease, infection, very high. Pollutants, no protections. And how do these people navigate their way? It's difficult for an educated person to navigate their way through a maze of hospitals. Okay? So those are the things you think about when you speak about a person not having any protections. We'll end here for today. I'll continue my story. Okay, well, we got this back on, but we don't have time right now. So we'll start with the images on Tuesday.